The room was silent. You could almost hear the heartbeat of Africa itself. In Windhoek, the capital of Namibia, the air was thick, not with ceremony, but with purpose. Two flags stood side by side, Botswana and Namibia. And at that moment, a voice rose, calm, measured, but unshakably firm. So we need to strengthen our alliance. Botswana, Namibia. It wasn't the kind of speech that fills the air with promises. It was one that demands accountability. The man at the podium wasn't asking for applause. He was asking for a new way of thinking, one that would stop the slow bleeding of Africa's potential. For decades, neighboring nations have been set up to compete for markets, for recognition, for survival. Namibia exports beef, Botswana exports beef. But the question was piercing: what are we competing on? That single question sliced through years of polite diplomacy and empty panels. Because the truth is, Africa has never lacked resources. It has lacked coordination. And for the first time, someone stood up and said it plainly. The message was clear. The time for competition is over. The time for complementarity, for cooperation built on empathy, realism, and shared destiny has come. The room leaned in. Elder statesmen, diplomats, soldiers, they all listened to a man who dared to say what few ever would: we are not begging to be recognized. We claim our place. That moment was bigger than Botswana or Namibia. It was about the entire continent finding its rhythm again, from the dry plains of the Kalahari to the streets of Ouagadougou, where leaders like Ibrahim Traoré are already proving that action, not words, defines sovereignty. So here's the question: can Africa truly rise when its nations stop competing and start completing each other? Please share if you believe Africa's unity begins with cooperation, not rivalry. Subscribe if you believe that true leadership is about doing, not doubting. The story begins not with war, but with a meeting table. Two neighboring nations, Botswana and Namibia, sat down to speak not as competitors, but as equals. It was supposed to be another bilateral summit, another round of polite diplomatic statements. But something unexpected happened that day. The man speaking, the representative of Botswana, broke from the script. He didn't recite statistics or read policy notes. He spoke with the conviction of someone who had grown tired of bureaucracy and tired of waiting. We must avoid unnecessary competition. Botswana must not seek to outcompete Namibia. Namibia must not seek to outcompete Botswana. Those words stunned the room. For decades, African politics had been built on the illusion that every country must stand alone to be strong. But this leader was dismantling that illusion right before everyone's eyes. He talked about beef, the pride of both economies, how both nations raise cattle, export meat to the European Union, and face the same market challenges. Namibia is a beef-producing country. Botswana is a beef-producing country. What are we competing on? The logic was simple but revolutionary. Why fight for the same slice of a market when they could combine forces and dominate it together? When Botswana fails to meet its export quota, Namibia could step in and fill the gap. That's complementarity, one nation's weakness covered by another's strength. It wasn't just about economics. It was about rethinking the psychology of leadership. In a world designed to keep African nations divided and dependent, cooperation becomes the most radical act of defiance. He went further. He spoke of empathy, a word rarely heard in geopolitics. When Namibia cries out to Botswana and says, "Your policies on cement have hurt my people," Botswana must pause and reflect with empathy. It was a call for governments to act as neighbors, not rivals, to care for each other's pain, because one nation's loss always bleeds into another's. He turned to the question of infrastructure, and the tone grew sharper. The airline of Namibia had collapsed. Botswana's was collapsing. Both had too few passengers, too little funding, and too much pride to ask for help. What can these two countries do in the area of airline transportation? What can they do, not in competition, but in collaboration? That silence that followed was heavier than applause, because every official in that room knew he was right. Then came the question of the Trans-Kalahari rail line and oil pipelines projects that had been stuck for years in paperwork and political fear. When are we starting work? When are we translating these sermons into lived reality? That word sermons echoed like thunder. For too long, Africa had been preaching about integration, about Pan-African unity, about building from within, but little ever moved beyond speeches and signatures. In that moment, the meeting transformed into a mirror. Each leader saw themselves reflected as both the problem and the potential solution. Because Africa's revolution will not begin with new slogans, but with coordination, real, measurable collaboration between nations that share borders, dreams, and destinies. By the time he finished, the air had shifted. It wasn't just a policy meeting anymore. It was a declaration of intent to build a new economic axis in southern Africa to connect resources, industries, and people beyond colonial boundaries. And when he said, "We must know the best that is known and think the best that is thought in the world," his voice trembled, not with fear, but with urgency. That's when you could feel it. Something was awakening. Not the nationalism of the past, but the unity of the future. A unity built not on the fantasy of being the best alone, but on the courage to be better together. Because maybe, just maybe, the real revolution of Africa won't come from soldiers or slogans. It will come from two neighbors deciding quietly but firmly to trust each other. As the hall settled into silence, the air in Windhoek grew heavy. Everyone from ministers to diplomats could feel that this was no longer a mere speech. It was a confrontation with complacency. Then the tone shifted. The man's voice grew sharper, more personal, as he looked across the room filled with suits and medals. Sometimes he said, "You people frustrate me." A nervous laugh rippled through the audience, but he didn't smile. "Yes, I get frustrated by you public officers, your rigidities, your sluggishness, your inability to respond instantly, decisively, boldly." The room froze. Every diplomat understood that this was not anger, it was a cry for urgency. He wasn't just addressing Botswana or Namibia. He was speaking to every African nation trapped in procedure while the world races ahead. He was demanding an end to performative leadership, the kind where progress dies under mountains of protocol. "That's why you refer to yourselves as excellencies," he said quietly. "But me, I'm just a boy to everybody." Laughter broke again, but this time it was different. It was the sound of realization. By calling himself a boy, he stripped away the pretense that has long suffocated African leadership. He wasn't lowering himself, he was liberating himself from the vanity of titles. This was the climactic moment, the collision between old Africa and new Africa, between the leaders who cling to titles and the ones who dare to act. Then came the line that electrified the hall: "We are not begging to be recognized. We claim our place. You are forced to look at us." Those words carried the weight of centuries. Every head in the room lifted. Every official suddenly remembered the people waiting back home, the farmers, the jobless youth, the mothers watching from small houses lit by candlelight. The hall erupted in applause, not the polite kind, but the heavy, thundering kind that comes when people recognize truth. But he wasn't finished. He wanted to push them further. He turned philosopher, quoting from Bruce Lee's writings not as a gimmick but as a metaphor for African destiny. "There are two kinds of people," he said, "doers and doubters. The doubters said men can't fly. The doers said maybe, but we will try, and they soared into the morning glow while the doubters watched from below." Then he paused, looked around, and asked, "Which are we? Are we doers or are we doubters?" That question cut deeper than any statistic or policy paper. Because for too long, Africa's greatest tragedy has not been its poverty, but its hesitation. He reminded everyone of the millions who believe in change, but see no action. "Our people are hungry," he said. "They are unclad. They are unhoused. They are unfed. They want to eat. They want to work. They want to live." And then his voice rose, steady, determined. "A revolution is not amorphous. It's not endless. It must achieve results within a period of time." He wasn't calling for chaos. He was calling for discipline, a revolution of accountability. He warned that time was not infinite. Every day of inaction is a day stolen from the hopes of the poor. So he demanded timelines, deliverables, and deadlines. This was no longer a speech. It was a mirror held up to every African leader who had ever hidden behind excuses. By the end, even those who disagreed with his tone couldn't deny his truth. For the first time in years, they weren't talking about aid loans or Western validation. They were talking about results, empathy, and courage. And as the applause returned louder than before, one truth became clear. The revolution he spoke of wasn't theoretical. It was already happening in the way people listened, in the way they began to believe again that Africa's destiny wasn't written elsewhere. In that hall between two small nations, something monumental had shifted. They were no longer competitors in trade or rivals in policy. They had become partners in awakening. And that perhaps was the true beginning of Africa's new revolution, not born of anger, but of understanding that unity itself is the most radical act of all. After the applause faded, what remained was reflection and the beginning of change. Because in that room something had cracked. Not the system, not yet, but the mindset that kept Africa moving in circles. The first consequence of that speech wasn't written in government memos or policy statements. It appeared quietly in the conversations of ordinary people. In Gaborone's cafes and Windhoek's markets, citizens began to ask new questions. Why do we compete with our neighbors when we could build with them? Fishermen near Walvis Bay spoke of Botswana as a partner, not a rival. Farmers in Maun began wondering what it would mean if Namibian trucks could cross the border without delay, sharing cold storage, sharing profits, sharing hope. That was the civil revolution, small, invisible, but unstoppable. For years, the ordinary African had been told that unity was an idea for presidents and parliaments. But this time, the idea moved down into the streets, into the voices of taxi drivers, teachers, mothers. It no longer felt like diplomacy, it felt like survival. Politically, the impact was just as profound. The governments of Botswana and Namibia had spent years trapped in bureaucratic inertia, each ministry guarding its turf, each department afraid to share. But after that day, meetings began to change. Officials who once spoke in rehearsed tones started using words like collaboration, timeline, shared output. The discussion of the Trans-Kalahari rail line, long stuck in feasibility studies, gained new urgency. The pipeline corridor connecting Walvis Bay to the heart of Botswana, a dream delayed for decades, found itself back on the agenda. The ripple effect spread beyond the two nations. South Africa, Zambia, and Angola, watching from the sidelines, began to reassess their regional postures. Could this model of complementarity become a new blueprint for the African Union's vision of continental integration? Civil society, too, began to stir. University students quoted the line, "We are not begging to be recognized. We claim our place." On social media and campus posters, writers and musicians turned it into a rhythm, a chorus, a new Pan-African anthem of self-worth. For the first time in years, nationalism didn't sound like exclusion, it sounded like connection. But this awakening wasn't without tension. Some politicians tied to old economic interests viewed the message as dangerous. They feared losing control, losing the comfort of foreign validation and predictable hierarchy. Because if cooperation truly took root, power would shift away from the elite and toward the people who actually build, plant, drive, and trade. That's what made the message revolutionary. It wasn't just about Botswana and Namibia. It was about dismantling the colonial blueprint of division that still lingers in African politics: invisible borders, artificial rivalries, imported economic models that reward isolation instead of solidarity. And so as leaders debated and citizens discussed, one truth became undeniable. This wasn't just a bilateral meeting anymore. It was a test for Africa's political maturity. Would the continent finally prove that unity can be practical, not just poetic? Could two small nations trigger a continental realignment built on empathy instead of ego, in a world tired of speeches and promises that question whispered first in Windhoek now echoed across Africa? Because the people had heard something real, something different. They didn't just hear a call for cooperation. They heard the first heartbeat of a new political age, one in which the measure of leadership is not how loudly you speak, but how quickly you act. When that speech was replayed on international networks, the world didn't quite know how to respond. To Western analysts, it sounded unusual, too philosophical for African politics, too bold to be diplomatic. But those who listened carefully understood it was a warning to the old order. The statement, "We are not begging to be recognized. We claim our place," landed like a quiet thunderclap in Washington, Paris, and Brussels. Because behind those words was a declaration that Africa was no longer asking to sit at the table, it was building its own. In Washington, the reaction was measured but uneasy. The State Department called it an inspiring display of regional cooperation, but off-record officials worried that such rhetoric would further weaken Western leverage in southern Africa. Botswana had long been seen as a model ally, a nation of stability and moderation. But now it was speaking the language of sovereignty, the same tone heard in Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey under the rising influence of Ibrahim Traoré and the AS Alliance. For decades, the U.S. and Europe have defined Africa by aid packages and advisory mission systems that preserved dependency under the mask of partnership. Yet here stood two nations declaring that their future would be built through complementarity, not charity. In Europe, headlines framed it as Southern Africa's cooperative experiment. But inside policy circles, strategists understood what it really meant. If small nations like Botswana and Namibia could coordinate economically, the domino effect could reshape trade routes, supply chains, and alliances across the continent. France, still struggling to maintain its grip over former colonies, viewed it with particular concern. The African awakening, once seen as a rhetorical movement, was now producing operational frameworks, real pipelines, shared air routes, joint export plans. That kind of progress doesn't just challenge old empires, it renders them irrelevant. Meanwhile, China and Russia watched closely. Beijing saw an opportunity. The principles of plausible complementarity aligned perfectly with its Belt and Road strategy of interconnected infrastructure. Moscow, ever eager to gain influence in Africa's security and energy sectors, saw a chance to support this new bloc of independent nations as a counterbalance to NATO's global reach. But for the United States, this moment posed a philosophical challenge. American policy toward Africa has often oscillated between neglect and control, between promises of democracy and the politics of containment. Now Africa was offering a third-path cooperation without permission. And that was unsettling. Because when African leaders start speaking not in the language of grievance, but of strategy, not of dependence, but of determination, it signals the end of the post-colonial script the West had grown comfortable with. For the Western public, however, the message resonated differently. To many ordinary Americans, especially those who remember the civil rights era, the call for doers, not doubters, felt deeply familiar. It echoed Martin Luther King's urgency, Kennedy's optimism, and Malcolm X's demand for dignity. Perhaps that's why older audiences abroad began to take notice. They could see in Africa's young leaders the same hunger their own generations once carried, the same belief that moral courage could still shape history. In that sense, the speech was not just African. It was universal, a reminder that the future belongs not to those who wait for approval, but to those who act with conviction. And somewhere between Washington's caution and Ouagadougou's defiance, the world began to realize Africa is no longer a story to be told by others, it is telling its own, one partnership at a time. When the speech ended, there was no fanfare, only the echo of truth. The man stepped back from the podium and the hall remained silent for a moment too long, as if everyone was afraid to breathe. Then came the applause, long, steady, and heavy with understanding. But even as they clapped, he wasn't celebrating. He lifted his hand gently and said, "We've spoken. We've drawn plans. We've laid out our outlines. But will they come when we do call for them?" That question hung in the air like smoke. It wasn't aimed at the audience in Windhoek alone. It was aimed at the entire African continent and perhaps at humanity itself. Because words, no matter how inspiring, are only spirits until they take form. The revolutions of our time, political, social, spiritual, die not from bullets, but from delay. And Africa, he warned, could no longer afford the luxury of delay. "We have a revolution to effect," he said earlier, and a revolution is not shapeless. It must be compressed in time and determinate in outcome. That single idea, a time-bound revolution, may be the most powerful message of our era, because it challenges not just leaders, but citizens to move from admiration to action. The political consequence is clear. Africa's future will not be written by doubters. The civil consequence is even clearer. If unity fails, poverty will win. And for the rest of the world, for Washington, for Paris, for Beijing, the warning is unmistakable. The age of managing Africa from afar is over. A generation of doers has risen, pragmatic, impatient, and fiercely sovereign. Yet beyond politics, this moment carries something deeper, a human truth. No continent, no nation, no person can rise alone. The beauty of life, like the strength of Africa, lies in complementarity, in the way we fill each other's gaps. From Windhoek to Ouagadougou, from the Sahel to the Atlantic, a quiet revolution is unfolding, built not on conquest, but on cooperation. And perhaps that is the real lesson for us all, whether we sit in Africa, America, or anywhere in between. So tonight, as you watch this, ask yourself, are you a doubter or a doer? Will you wait for others to shape the world, or will you help build it with empathy, courage, and clarity of purpose? Because Africa's march forward has begun. The question is not whether the world will notice. The question is, will the world keep up? Please share if you believe that Africa's rise depends on cooperation, not competition. Subscribe if you believe that the spirit of leaders like Ibrahim Traoré and the unity of nations like Botswana and Namibia can still inspire the world. Because the future doesn't belong to the powerful, it belongs to the doers.